This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, in the last few years, changes in the business and culture of news have inspired lots of debate about the nature of journalism and how to pay for it. It's become common to speak of a crisis in print journalism, if not the death of the printed newspaper. And in this context, a number of news organizations have turned to copyright law in an attempt to stop the unauthorized reposting of their stories online. But their actions remain controversial. On the one side are those who defend the right of Google and other news aggregators to repost the headline and lead paragraph of a story with a link to the original source. They say that such service is in the public interest and that prohibiting it would impede the democratic potential of the internet. On the other side are those who see such reposting as piracy, a form of copying that undermines the ability of news organizations to recoup their investment in the news, and by free riding on the work of others, the news aggregators threaten the very existence of quality journalism. Now, as a historian, what strikes me about these debates is that they're not new. Concern about news piracy and attempts to combat it go back to the 17th century, and a number of times this debate has resurfaced, and the controversy has centered on the differences between news, which we could define simply as accounts of recent events, and other forms of writing. So I'm working on a book called Who Owns the News, which traces the history of copyright in journalism in the United Kingdom and the United States from the 17th century to the early 20th century. And today I'm going to limit my remarks just to the UK and focus on a few moments in this debate. The history of copyright is usually framed as a narrative of expansion. Over time, the law comes to protect a greater and greater variety of works for a longer and longer period of time. And this narrative, especially when accompanied by lists like this one, tends to suggest a direct relationship between technological change and the evolution of the law. It's most obvious with photography, piano rolls, records. When a new technology is developed, a new law comes to protect the copying and transmitting of texts. These narratives also tend to emphasize the importance of material form. A book might contain philosophical essays, or sermons, or fiction, or anything else, but still qualify for copyright because it's recognized as a book. An engraved image or a stage play needs to await its own law because even if it's printed, it's not the same thing as a book. As you can see, books were covered by Act of Parliament in the UK from 1710. Periodicals were not protected until 1842, and newspapers not explicitly mentioned by copyright law until 1911. But I want to complicate this narrative of an inevitable expansion. A closer look at the example of news publications challenges these three standard assumptions: the narrative of expansion, the role of technology, and the importance of material form. So, with respect to the first point, the history of copyright usually begins in 1710, but if we return to an earlier era, then the 18th century can rightly be viewed as a period of contraction rather than a period of expansion in individual property rights over texts. Now, in the 16th and 17th centuries, no need to copy all of this, I'm just going to point to it a couple of times. Trade customs and government regulations in England recognized property rights in all sorts of texts, whatever their material form or subject, including those devoted to recent events, what we would now call news. There were two basic kinds of privilege. And both of these combine permission, authorization to print a particular text, with the exclusive right to do so. The word privilege means private law. In other words, a right granted to an individual or a group to do something that other people are not allowed to do. So on the one hand, there were privileges granted by the monarch, which could cover individual works or whole categories of works. So an individual patent holder had the right, the exclusive right to print laws, acts of parliament, proclamations. Another printer had the patent for the Bible in English, yet another for legal texts, and so on. These were commercial monopolies that were limited in duration. On the other hand, there were privileges that resulted from registration with the Stationers' Company. The Stationers' Company is basically the guild of printers and booksellers based in London. The monarchy made a deal with the guild and said, you have the exclusive right to operate presses and to sell printed matter in England. Why would the monarchy do that? It was a way of regulating the world of print. In exchange for this monopoly, the Stationers' Company agrees to police its own members to make sure that members of the guild don't print texts that would offend the state or the church. And in exchange for this, they also agree to submit their works to censorship. Once they've done so, the individual member who submitted his text to censorship and has registered it with the Stationers' Company gets a property in that text, the exclusive right to print and sell that work for an unlimited period of time. And they did treat this as perpetual property that could be bought, sold, and inherited. Now, publications devoted to current events, what we call news, were subject to both types of privilege. For example, in 1620, unauthorized news publications covering the 30 Years' War began to appear in England. These were some of the first news periodicals that consisted of bulletins of news from various places in Europe. You can't see this very well, but each one of the bulletins is coming from a different place and giving usually accounts of war and diplomacy. At first, King James I prohibited these courantos. They were called courantos because they provide a kind of current of news. That's the same origin of being au courant. You're knowing what's going on each week. So James I prohibited them, but then he realized that interest in the news was too strong, and that he appointed a licensor to authorize news publications by a select group of stationers. So these men could print news as long as they agreed to limit themselves to foreign news, avoid news about England, and enter their works in the Stationers' Company. So you see here a couple of them that enter their work. They've passed through censorship, and they've got the approval of the censor for a current of general news dated the 14th of May. Well, for most of the 17th century, news didn't really appear in newspapers, which were closely regulated, but in separate publications, such as small brochures, called pamphlets in English, or even more commonly in the form of broadside ballads. They're called broadsides because they're printed on one side of a sheet of paper that's turned broadside, so like landscape instead of portrait, and they're printed on one side so that they can be posted to a wall or a post for public viewing or in the home. And these often concerned news. This one reports the Dutch cruelty towards English merchants at Amboina in 1624, and as far as I know, is the first published visual documentation of the form of torture now known as waterboarding. In any case, the imprint at the bottom says, "You may read more of this bloody tragedy in a book printed by authority, printed at London by F. Cools." So F. Cools was the publisher of this broadside, but also the publisher of a book about the same event. He registered both with the Stationers' Company, and he therefore had the exclusive right to this news in a couple of different forms of publication. But registration did not eliminate the problem of piracy, didn't stop other people from reprinting. Here we have another ballad which has, this may be printed, RP, so it has the authorization of a censor. And then at the bottom, I'm going to zoom in on this, the printer says to the reader, "You are desired to beware of a false counterfeit song in imitation of this true copy, which is only printed for J. Deacon at the Angel in Guildspur Street." So he's warning the reader there are counterfeit, pirated versions of my ballad out there. And the very fact that printers and booksellers complained of this shows that they believed that street ballads and news periodicals could be property in the same way as, say, philosophical treatises or dictionaries. This form of licensing was temporarily disrupted during the English Civil War. The struggle between the Parliament and the King made it hard for anyone to exercise full censorship, and there was an outpouring of news publications and commentaries about Parliament and the King. But not very long, within 2 years, the Stationers' Company made a deal with Parliament that restored licensing. And what's interesting to me here is that they're mentioning all kinds of publications: book, pamphlet, paper, part of book, pamphlet, paper. Anything you print needs to be registered, and anything that's registered cannot be reprinted without the consent of the owner of that book, part of a book, paper, pamphlet, and so on. After the restoration of the monarchy, the 1662 Licensing Act required registration and severely limited who could print news. And for a long time, the London Gazette was the only newspaper printed by authority. But again, the provisions of the Act, both censorship and literary property, could apply for a whole range of publications. Any book, ballad, chart, portraiture, or anything or things whatsoever. Right? So you see the problem, what I'm getting at. That first Copyright Act in 1710 only says book, but the world before it covered almost everything. Now, this Licensing Act was not permanent. It had to be periodically renewed by Parliament. And when it came up for renewal in 1695, there was so much disagreement that Parliament refused to continue licensing. And this had two important consequences. First, there was no more pre-publication censorship in England after 1695. And second, there was no more monopoly for the Stationers' Company. After 1695, anyone could set up a press anywhere in the country, and they could print without authorization from the censors, let alone the Guild. And this led to a dramatic increase in the number of newspapers, but it also led to complaints about piracy, because remember that licensing had combined permission to print with the exclusive right to print. So now that there was no more permission needed, there was also no more property. So during the 15 years after the expiration of licensing, the Stationers repeatedly asked Parliament, help us. There's people pirating us. We've lost. The trade is going under. And in their petitions to Parliament, most booksellers argued, and printers, that literary property was a crucial incentive for the production of learned books. So they focused on books that were expensive to produce, that took time to produce, dictionaries, treatises, and so on. But at least one, a more minor printer, also included more humble publications. He said, there's no civilized state, or city in the world where such an extensive liberty is allowed to any people as in this, where news and all other sorts of papers are suffered to be pirated and cried about the streets by a parcel of vagabond hawkers, to the great prejudice and ruin of the just proprietors of such papers. So it wasn't impossible to think that these more ephemeral publications could be owned. But in 1710, Parliament passed a law for the protection of literary property and made no mention of pamphlets, papers, parts of books, as previous regulations had. The opening lines This first Copyright Act was called an Act for the Encouragement of Learning. And the opening lines referred to books and other writings. So there was an opening there. What did the legislature mean by other writings? But all of the provisions of the Act, all of the practical mechanisms referred only to books. And ever since, people have assumed that it only applied to books. The stated justification of the law was to encourage learned men to compose and write useful books. Well, the fact that the statute didn't mention periodicals has led many to assume that these writings simply were not covered, as if the law says something and therefore people obey it. And that contemporaries applied different rules for texts based on their material form. According to that logic, a periodical, a daily periodical like Addison and Steele's Spectator, it was a very popular daily essay periodical, would have to be bound, reissued as a set of bound books before it could be registered for copyright and claimed as literary property. That would be the logic that many historians of publishing have followed. But that's not correct, because if you look at the registrations for copyright, many periodicals were registered. The Tatler is another periodical, and if you look at the registration, this is someone declaring, saying, this is my property. What does he say? From number 1 to number 200 inclusive, and every single number of them with the preface, index, etc., in folio, octavo, and 12s, and all other volumes whatsoever is here entered as the property of John Nutt. Well, what is he doing? He's saying any future version of this text, whether it's published in a large, expensive folio or a small, portable edition, is my property. So, not material form, but the text that's being protected. Others even attempted to publish periodicals as an ongoing concern. So a literary periodical, The Rhapsody, to be published 3 days every week. So just claiming, please stay off my property. Even for the prices of stocks and so on. So a twice weekly periodical that was simply giving the prices of stocks, this person says, I think that that's mine. Well, the problem is the validity of these registrations was never tested by the courts. So it's not as though a judge said, yes, you actually own this. We don't know. All we can say is that publishers attempted to protect periodicals as literary property. But what's interesting is that these attempts only lasted for about 10 years after the passage of the statute. So they briefly experimented with a new law, and then they turned away from the law. And I would argue they turned away from copyright and settled on a shared culture of excerpting and reprinting. And in this respect, the 1730s were a very important turning point. The 1730s saw the creation of the first successful monthly magazines. And this led to a brief debate about literary property. Edward Cave, who published the Gentleman's Magazine, accused his rivals at the London Magazine of stealing his design, his plan, and his title. And if you look at it, they indeed imitated not only the contents are very similar, the way it's organized is very similar, but Gentleman's Magazine or Monthly Intelligencer, London Magazine or Gentleman's Monthly Intelligencer. Cave was also the first to use the term magazine to refer to a compilation of texts instead of a military storehouse, which is the original meaning of the term. And so Cave said that he should have, a property in this way of arranging text, in this kind of publication. The owners of the London Magazine said, no, you're actually the pirate. You're the one who's reprinting material from newspapers and weekly journals that doesn't belong to you. And indeed, Cave did not hide that fact at all. Look at the title page to the Gentleman's Magazine. This is St. John's Gate, where his press was located. But holding up the edifice is the list of all the newspapers and periodicals that he's copying from. London Gazette, London Journal, Fogg's Journal. They're all bricks holding up his edifice. And he said, this is a service for the public. I'm taking texts which are available, which are circulating, and I'm putting them together in a useful digest. I'm selecting, I'm editing, and I'm giving it to you for a much lower price. Well, that was not, did not make the proprietors of the London magazine happy. They thought there should be some way to own the individual text, the individual articles, whether it's a poem or an essay or a news paragraph, should be owned like any other text. And they were supported in this argument by the editor of another periodical called the Grub Street Journal. He agreed, Richard Russell agreed, that contributions to periodicals should be protected by copyright in the same way that books were. Cave responded to him and said, but look at what you do in the Grub Street Journal. You simply copy all of the daily newspapers. So it had come full circle. The monthlies were accused of pirating the weeklies, and the weeklies were accused of pirating the dailies. Well, Russell said, like Cave, he said, my copying is in the public interest. If you look at newspapers, normally they have paragraphs of news that are not particularly organized by subject. We don't know who wrote each one of the paragraphs, and they change from one subject to another. But if you look at what I'm doing, is I'm taking all of the newspapers and what they say about a particular topic, and I'm putting it one after the other with credit. Yesterday, Their Majesties hunted a buck in Richmond New Park for the first time. That's the report of the Daily Post Boy and the Daily Advertiser. But according to the Daily Post, it was a stag, not a buck. According to the Daily Journal, it was a hind. According to the Daily Post Boy, it afforded some hours diversion. So he's, on the one hand, he's making fun of the inane kinds of texts that pass for journalism in London. And on the other hand, he's pointing out that not only do a lot of the newspapers contain the same information, but they also contradict each other. And the only way to make sense of what is going on in the world is to be able to excerpt and put the accounts next to each other, much like news aggregators and blogs do on the internet today. Russell also thought that you couldn't own news because news wasn't a form of authorship like other forms of authorship. He said, no man can assume to himself a property by employing persons to collect a heap of trivial, ridiculous, and false paragraphs of news and then publishing them daily to the world. So for Russell, news was gathered rather than written. It was collected by paid employees rather than composed by authors. And the final product tended to be unsubstantial and unreliable, and therefore not a matter of encouraging learning. Well, this first debate about whether or not news writing could be copyrighted didn't last very long. And within a few years, Edward Cave's brand of reprinting became the norm. After the 1730s, there was very little discussion about literary property in periodical writings for the rest of the 18th century. If we want to understand why, I would say one explanation is that there was a fundamental change in the business of publishing in the middle of the 18th century, when a particular kind of newspaper that I would call the advertiser model of newspaper, because it's a large format newspaper that contains lots of advertisements, paragraphs of news, prices, but also some essays, some letters from readers. It's a mix of content. That's a departure from the older Gazette model of journalism, which still prevailed on the continent and had been the basis in England in the early 18th century. This kind of newspaper made it much harder for separate essay publications to exist. In the days of the Spectator or the Tatler, newspapers limited themselves to short bulletins of foreign news. Now newspapers were printing all sorts of texts, excerpts from pamphlets, price lists, essays written by readers, and so on. And so it now became much harder to claim these essays as literary property. all the texts were circulating through the newspaper. All of them belonged to the public. So by the 1760s, it had become much harder to defend a literary property in journalistic texts than it had been before. So in hindsight, this lack of copyright for journalism in the 18th century could be seen as a legacy of the copyright statute, which the name was an act for the encouragement of learning. Learning was supposed to be encouraged by limiting the duration of the copyright, by requiring every publisher to submit 9 copies of every book to be distributed to the different libraries in the kingdom. There were also price controls mentioned in the statute, although those were never actually enforced. And it permitted the importation of foreign language books. It did not cover translations or abridgments, and it did not cover writings in periodicals. So far, most of the attention of copyright historians has been on the duration, battles over how long should copyright last. And there was a lot of battle over that in the 18th century. But I would argue there was also debate about the scope of copyright. What would it cover? What kinds of text? What kinds of uses? And if you look at that, you see that 18th century judges upheld the right to freely abridge or translate works covered by copyright. Because judges said an abridgment, a condensed version of a text, does encourage learning. It spreads learning. A translation of a text spreads learning, spreads access. So they were upholding the rights that Edward Cave and others were claiming by simply reprinting text from other publications. So you could argue that it was a legacy of the Act, but what I would argue is something a little bit different. It was the culture of publishing that shaped people's understanding of copyright law. It was not the fact that newspapers weren't mentioned in the statutes that people thought, oh, I can therefore copy newspapers. It was this culture of publishing that shaped people's understanding of copyright law, and the 18th century was a period of contraction in the types of works assumed to be covered by copyright, and a corresponding recognition of the public's right to excerpt, comment on, and recirculate news and political commentary. Okay, but there's a problem, because actual access to newspapers was limited. The way that the government taxed newspapers actually kept them out of reach of a large section of the population. Beginning in 1712, all newspapers were required to be printed on stamped paper, and this immediately doubled the cost of newspapers. The tax was then increased in 1757, 1776, and so on, so that by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the average newspaper cost 7 pence per copy, a significant amount of money for most of the population. In addition to this stamp duty, there were taxes on advertisements and on the paper itself. This led to a situation in which it cost a lot of money to operate a legitimate newspaper. And these newspapers tended to cater to the mercantile and political elite. But there was also an illegal, unstamped press. Illegal newspapers that were produced at low cost, that didn't buy the stamp, that sold for a penny or two instead of 7 pence. And these unstamped papers catered to a wider public and contained more daring political commentary. Now, the established London papers that did pay the stamp complained about unfair competition, and they asked the government to enforce the law more strictly. Many writers and printers went to jail for producing unstamped papers, but it was impossible to stop them entirely, in part because what was becoming known as the tax on knowledge was being fought both within and without the Parliament. And it was this campaign to end the stamp duty, rather than any sort of technological change, that brought the question of copyright for periodicals back into the open in the 1830s. The question was discussed as early as 1832, when the successful author and MP Edward Bulwer Lytton gave a long speech in the House of Commons moving for the repeal of the stamp duty. Bulwer-Lytton argued, as many others would, that the success of the unstamped press was caused by the stamp duty. If you simply remove the stamp duty, then ordinary people, workers, would have access to mainstream general interest newspapers, and talented writers, whatever their political persuasion, would have the opportunity to publish their own periodicals, which would then counteract the potentially dangerous or misleading information that everyone thought was circulating in the unstamped papers. But what really got the attention of the established London newspapers was that advocates for repeal of the stamp referred to the stamp duty as creating a monopoly of 5 or 6 London newspapers. And such a monopoly was not acceptable in a country that claimed to have a free press. On the other side, opponents of repealing the stamp argued that operating a serious newspaper cost money, and that if you remove the stamp, you would ruin the property, all the investment made by the London daily papers. And that was unacceptable in a country which claimed to respect private property. Bulwer-Lytton's motion was withdrawn. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, main opposition, according to him, was that the country could not afford to do without the revenue that came from the stamp. That's the official line. But this tension between the public's right to knowledge on the one hand and the business owner's right to property on the other remained central to subsequent discussions of the press. In 1835, Bulwer-Lytton renewed his motion, and this time the Chancellor of the Exchequer opposed repeal on fiscal grounds, but this time he also stressed the need to protect the press against piracy before repealing the stamp. He invoked a hypothetical situation. Suppose a large newspaper, everyone knew he was talking about the London Times, but he said, suppose a large newspaper spends a lot of money on foreign correspondence and on machinery to print news early in the day. If there's no protection, then someone could simply reproduce the news that was procured at great expense without spending a penny of his own. In the spring of 1836, a number of established daily newspapers watched carefully as a bill to reduce the stamp duty worked its way through Parliament. The morning papers submitted petitions complaining about imperfections in the bill, including the lack of copyright. An editorial in the Morning Herald, for example, tried to explain why newspapers deserve some form of protection. He actually thought copyright protected all literary compositions, anything written. And so if a newspaper owner registered his work for copyright, why not? He could have copyright. But this would not be useful at all because it would require a trial, and by the time the trial was over, the damage would be done and the news would be old. In other words, news had to be fresh to be saleable, and newspapers needed to be able to ask for a summary judgment before a magistrate rather than a jury trial. And this magistrate could simply order the pirate to stop printing the news and pay damages to the copyright owner. Right? So this argument that news is not like other kinds of knowledge, it's quick. Well, without really elaborating on these points, the owners of the London daily papers were introducing several ideas that were foreign to the concept and the practice of copyright. The first novelty was the claim that the importance of speed in the news required a different set of procedures than those usually followed for other types of publication, namely the recourse to a local magistrate who could convict without a trial. The second novelty, perhaps less objectionable than the first, was that the copyright duration on news would be very short. Perhaps a day, perhaps a few hours was all that was needed, certainly not 28 years or the lifetime of the author. But the most important novelty was the argument that news, written accounts of current events, could be owned. That argument faced a number of barriers. The first barrier was cultural tradition. Copying and republication of news had been done for as long as anyone could remember, and editors and printers knew that copying was what enabled the news to spread. That was a basic fact. Before the Telegraph, the only way news spread was through copying. The political argument against a copyright in news began with the assumption that such a copyright would restrict the flow of information of public concern while enabling a few individuals to profit from monopoly in that information. And from there, it was easy to question on what legal basis news could even qualify for copyright. The standard justifications for copyright in the UK combine two notions: the author's natural right to control publication and the public interest in encouraging the production of useful works. As far as the legislature and the courts were concerned in the UK, the second argument, based on social utility, was at the heart of British copyright law. Copyright was defined as an exclusive right during a limited period of time to print or sell a particular work. And this was created by statute. It did not result directly from the author's natural rights. That's what the court said in any case. Given that this was the case, the newspaper owners had to argue that it was in the public interest to grant a newspaper owner the exclusive right to print and sell a piece of news even for a few hours. They also had to convince some skeptical people that the authorship of news was comparable to the authorship of, say, poetry or history, and that was an idea that not many people were willing to accept. Well, all of these arguments and counter-arguments would be developed and refined by newspaper owners and lawyers over the next 100 years. But in 1836, the political barrier was the most important one, precisely because the demand for copyright was a direct response to the campaign to end the taxes on knowledge. You're going to end the taxes on knowledge, but create a new tax in the form of a copyright? It was a very difficult argument to go against. I'd like to find out more about what workers who read the unstamped press and campaigned against the taxes on knowledge thought about this subject. We know, for example, that there were meetings to petition the legislature to repeal the stamp. At least one of these meetings, the radical leader Fergus O'Connor mocked the stamped press. He said, they want copyright, but they all copy each other, and they copy what's in the American press. They don't need copyright. Will they ever copyright what we write in the unstamped press? But what did ordinary readers think about copyright for news? I've yet to find any sources that enable me to answer that question. So far, it's a debate between newspaper editors and lawyers. Well, in the summer of 1836, it seemed as though the bill making its way through Parliament might include a copyright clause. The London dailies sent a draft of such a clause to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He supported the principle, and a number of MPs spoke in favor of protecting the labor and capital of large newspapers. But the Chancellor ultimately decided not to include a copyright clause. He thought it was a complicated issue and it should be treated separately. So in 1836, the stamp duty was reduced, but it wasn't repealed entirely. It was reduced significantly from 4 pence to 1 penny per copy. But you still had to have a stamp. The idea of a special copyright for news was then basically forgotten until 1851. In 1851, a parliamentary committee met to reconsider the ending of the stamp duty. By that time, the costs of gathering and disseminating the news had risen dramatically. The spread of the Telegraph in the late 1840s was an important factor, but so was the increasing use of paid reporters and foreign correspondents. By mid-century, the London Times had ambitions to become a national newspaper with readers all over the country. Its owners and editors may have been in favor of the free circulation of intelligence, but they were also worried about how the repeal of the stamp duty would create new competition for them in cities outside of London. The editor of a cheap newspaper could simply buy a copy of the Times in London, transmit its most important news by telegraph to Manchester, for example, and then reprint it for a local audience before copies of the Times arrived by railway. The editor of the Times therefore urged Parliament not to further encourage the provincial press, quote, which thrives not merely by appropriating our news, but by anticipating us in the circulation of it. A new newspaper called the Daily News joined the Times. in calling for a special copyright in Telegraph news. Their editor was Frederick Knight Hunt, and he argued forcefully for a copyright in news based on the high cost of telegraph transmission, rather than, say, the human labor involved in gathering or writing the news. This was a very different argument than those used by authors such as William Wordsworth or Charles Dickens, who highlighted originality and intellectual labor to justify expanded copyright protection. Advocates for a property right in news did not use that sort of language. Hunt even claimed that within the newspaper trade, it was considered perfectly acceptable to reprint essays, leading articles, reviews, the kinds of text that clearly took time and intellectual labor. Those could be copied. What was not acceptable, according to him, was to reprint short factual bulletins, what you might consider the low authorship stuff. Hunt argued that if adequate protection were not provided, then newspapers like the Times and Daily News would no longer invest in collecting news, and the public would suffer. Piracy would reduce the quantity and the quality of journalism that was available to the public. That's the same argument that we're hearing today by a number of news organizations in their fight against the aggregation sites such as Google News. Piracy hurts the public because we'll stop investing in quality journalism. But Hunt went one step further, insisting on a kind of protection that is completely foreign to copyright. He insisted that the property lay not in the form of the news, that is to say, the words used to express what happened, but also in the underlying factual details. But copyright law does not protect facts or ideas. It only protects the expression of those facts or ideas. As far as copyright's concerned, we're perfectly free to reformulate someone else's ideas in our own words. Norms related to plagiarism are separate. Depending on the cultural or professional context, we might be expected to cite the source of our information or give credit to other authors for their ideas. Completely separate question whether or not that work is protected by copyright. Hunt didn't think giving credit for borrowed news was enough. He said it was very costly to transmit news from, say, India to Britain, and whoever paid to transmit it should have the exclusive right to that news for a certain amount of time. He said, as the law protects a man who has brought from India a piece of cotton and paid for it, the law ought to protect a man who brings from India a piece of news and paid for it. Well, how long should that property last? He said, once the news has traveled through public channels, namely the post office, once it's traveled through the ordinary mail service, it's the property of the public. It's when you pay to transmit it through telegraph at high cost that it should be considered private property. So he gave the example. He said, an event takes place in Paris. Normally, an event in Paris will be known the next morning in London. It will arrive with the morning mail at 9 o'clock. Then all newspaper owners can print that event. But if someone pays to transmit the news by telegraph and the information arrives at 4 in the morning, then only that person should be able to print the news until 9 o'clock when it became public property. Well, what does all of this have to do with the stamp duty? Hunt and other newspaper owners believed that the stamp limited piracy because it raised the cost of producing a newspaper. The individuals who could afford to operate a stamped newspaper were governed by what Hunt called honesty and character. In other words, there was no need for copyright if the right people were operating the presses. But the owners of unstamped papers printed anything they could get their hands on. And Hunt and others thought that this was a matter of national honor. It became a cliche in these debates to hold up copies of French, English, and American newspapers to say that the English ones were the best, but this wasn't going to last long if you reduced the stamp or if you reduced the stamp without copyright. In 1855, Parliament moved forward with the bill to repeal the stamp duty, And the Chancellor of the Exchequer proposed a 24-hour copyright, so the lobbying paid off, for any original article, letter, paragraph, communication, or composition, or any material part thereof, or any colorable abridgment or alteration of the same. And as requested back in 1836, this right could be validated by a magistrate in a quick process that would stop the pirates in their tracks. The proposal attracted quite a bit of attention on the part of newspaper editors who wrote editorials for and against. The owners of the London daily newspapers claimed that the agitation against the stamp was directed at them, that one of the goals of repeal was to reduce the power of the metropolitan press in favor of the provincial press. Advocates of repeal indeed used the term monopoly, as I said, and the London dailies claimed to be unfairly punished for their initiative and their financial success. In this context, the London Daily News and one provincial paper, the Manchester Advertiser, which was clearly a mercantile commercial paper, tried to convince the provincial newspapers to support copyright. They said, look, papers outside of London, face it, you're reliant on the London press for parliamentary debates, for foreign news. You do other things in your local area, that's great, but you need them for that. And if pirates were allowed to have their way, then the London papers will stop investing in that kind of journalism and you won't have it anymore. They also suggested that the provincial newspapers might help subsidize the collection of the London news. After all, newspapers were paying telegraph companies to receive news. Why shouldn't they pay a little bit of money to the London Times for the right to reprint their articles? The telegraph companies were indeed part of the problem. The main one, the Electric Telegraph Company, developed its own news service beginning in 1848. Clerks for the telegraph company would buy copies of the London Times and other newspapers, select the most important content, summarize it, transmit it by telegraph to customers in the provinces, which could include newspapers, but also stock exchanges, hotels, clubs, associations that had reading rooms where you could go and learn the latest news. This whole phenomenon of subscription newsrooms has not received enough attention. It's very interesting. This is a recent photograph from a building in Durham, and you can barely see here on the above the door, subscription newsroom. Trying to imagine what happened in those rooms. This is an engraved image from the 19th century of the Manchester Public Library. It's not really a subscription newsroom, but it may give a suggestion of what it was like to go and read the news in public, standing up at these large folio stands where you could actually spread out the latest newspaper. But thanks to the telegraph companies, these newsrooms also had updates, not just the printed newspapers, but also very recent sports scores, price information, digests of parliamentary debates, votes, that sort of thing, would come in over the wire periodically throughout the day, encouraging a new attitude towards the news as something that you could seek out multiple times a day, not just something that you would only read in the morning. I mean, today we have this reflex, we're always seeking out news, but this is the first time that you're creating that kind of idea that it's going to be available at multiple times throughout the day, not just once. Provincial newspapers love this service because by paying a relatively small fee, they could acquire an efficient digest of news, and many saw this as an example of leveling the playing field, reducing the obstacle of distance, making time-sensitive information about commerce, politics, and sports available instantly, removing the advantage that London had always had over Manchester or Glasgow. The Manchester Times, for example, said, well, they're proposing to transmit the main ideas from all the articles in the newspapers so that for business purposes we shall scarcely be so much behind the metropolis in intelligence as by the transmission of light. We have heretofore been behind them in time. So this is an important context. People are starting to get information much faster. So of course they would react against the idea of a copyright in news. And provincial newspapers indeed developed two main arguments against a copyright in news. The first was that copyright would restrict the flow of information. The Leeds Mercury denounced the proposed copyright as the first attempt of the kind to interpose an obstruction to the free circulation of intelligence in this country. The Edinburgh-based Caledonian Mercury also found the measure completely impractical in any land where thought and speech are free. If the proposed 24-hour copyright had passed, no newspaper would be able to reprint an important piece of news for 24 hours. The second argument developed by provincial newspapers was that news was not eligible for copyright because it was different than other forms of writing. The Manchester Times admitted that copyright might make sense for original leading articles, biographies, theater reviews, but nobody was asking for copyright in these kinds of articles. What they wanted was protection of straightforward announcements about what had happened in the world. According to the Manchester Times, the true originality in news is found in the fact of occurrence. And this is the produce of the busy spirit of the world. In news, the element which confers proprietary rights upon the author or the translator is altogether wanting. The work of origination is already done. It is furnished ready-made to everybody who can twist a tongue or handle a pen. This idea that news doesn't have an author. So the Times and the Daily News were fighting a losing battle. The stamp duty was abolished in 1855 and no special copyright for news was granted. And there was no immediate flood of pirate newspapers either. But the news service operated by the Electric Telegraph Company remained a threat. So the Times found another solution. They immediately made a deal with the Electric Telegraph Company. The Times would give the company all of its news, not only the articles found in the printed editions, but access to all of its telegraphic dispatches coming in from all over the world. The Telegraph Company could transmit all of this news to its customers, the provincial newspapers, and subscription newsrooms. In exchange for this, the Times could transmit its own messages for free over the telegraph. That deal probably was much more profitable and much more useful than any copyright ever could have been. Well, at the end of the 1860s, the telegraph was nationalized in Britain. It became a department of the post office. Now, instead of making deals with the Electric Telegraph Company, the newspapers made deal with Reuters, still around, a subscription news service. The London papers had the right to use Reuters news within London. The provincial papers, which gathered together as a press association, had the exclusive right to Reuters in the provinces. So they carved up territory in absence of copyright. These institutional arrangements might explain why, for the rest of the century basically, there wasn't much more talk about copyright for news. There wasn't much more debate about it. But that's not the end of the story, because literary copyright, especially the problem of international piracy, was still a big deal. In 1886, representatives from a number of countries met in Bern to put together an international copyright agreement. The significance of that meeting for our purpose is that it established an influential distinction between news and other forms of writing that remained influential well into the 20th century. At Bern in 1886, it was decided that any article printed in a periodical could be reproduced, whether in translation or the original language, in any other member country of Bern without asking permission. The only exception was that if the author or publisher had specifically said at the top of the article, "Do not reproduce, all rights reserved," then it couldn't be. Well, journalists and publishers complained that when the Bern Convention was revised in 1896, periodical writings were divided into two classes. Literature and fiction would be protected the same as books. Articles on politics and current events would be open to copying. unless accompanied by a notice explicitly prohibiting republication. Another step was taken at Berlin in 1908, when a distinction was made between news of the day, right, occurrences of what had happened, which could always be freely copied, and more specialized articles, investigations of religion, politics, science, which could be reproduced as long as the original publication did not explicitly reserve the rights. Why? The justification was that information about what's going on in the world should not be subject to any restrictions. Journalism was different than other kinds of authorship, according to the people it met in Bern. Even today, news of the day remains outside the bounds of the Bern Convention. Not true on the national level. Back in the UK, courts were ready to uphold copyright for news, but this copyright bore little resemblance to the kind that had been proposed earlier in the century. There was a court case in 1892 in which an English judge held that the form of the news, the words that are used, could be protected by copyright, but not the underlying factual details. The British copyright statute was revised in 1911 to include explicit protection for newspapers on this kind of copyright, the form of news, not the underlying details. And yet, again, the story, it's difficult to know where and how to end it, because some newspapers and press agencies remain unsatisfied by copyright's lack of protection for the underlying factual details of news reports. So they turn to the courts to sue competitors on the basis of breach of contract or unfair competition, rather than copyright. And they were sometimes able, in those kinds of courts, to block the unauthorized republication of financial information or sports scores and so on. Well, the problem with courts of equity is that the parties are two companies who are engaged in a dispute. Public interest is largely ignored. That was not the case in debates over copyright, as we saw. Those debates in the 1730s, 1830s, and 1850s, the idea of copyright for accounts of current events was rejected on political and cultural grounds. Returning to those moments reveals that copyright is not simply something that inevitably expands over time. Its scope is the result of negotiation and experimentation, involving more or less public debate, depending on the circumstances. Returning to those moments also reveals that when it comes to copyright, news has often been treated differently than other forms of writing. The reasons for that have changed over time. In the 17th century, it had to do with censorship. A combination of censorship and commercial monopoly meant that news reports, whatever their form, could be owned. But it was kind of a perverse form of ownership. The idea was the monarch has the exclusive right, really, to discuss affairs of state and can grant to individuals a temporary right to do so. When printing privileges became detached from censorship and the public utility rationale of the first copyright statute emphasized useful books over all other forms of publication, and then changes in the business and culture of news during the 18th century meant that most writers and readers agreed that these texts belonged to the public. That political and cultural shift made it very difficult for anyone to claim exclusive rights over accounts of current events. We saw that an interest in copyright for news resurfaced in the 1830s and the 1850s as a result of changes in government policy. On both occasions, demands for copyright ran up against anti-monopoly sentiment and arguments about the free circulation of information. Technology was not a factor in the 1830s. It was a factor in the 1850s, but it really was a matter of who was operating the technology and what they were doing with it. The chairman of the Electric Telegraph Company was John Lewis Ricardo, a free market thinker who didn't support copyright at all, right? Actually fought against it. So they faced overwhelming opposition from those who defended this public interest in free news. When it comes to intellectual property, the rules worked out by writers, publishers, legislatures, and judges did not depend solely on the material form of the text or the technology being used to disseminate it. The evolution of the law also depended upon attitudes towards the subject and the political function of the work. News has always been treated differently than other genres of publication, regardless of the form or the technology being used to distribute it. Thank you.